My first contact with heavy music was in 1985. It was a time when the Scorpions spent several weeks in the Portuguese top sales with their double live album Worldwide Live. I watched the Still Loving You live clip so many times on TV, and every time I heard that clip I kept my ears wide open and I thought, wow, these guys are amazing.
My mom was close friends with these folks that lived just a couple of miles away. I was maybe 7 or 8 at the time, so this goes back to the early 80s, and they had a teenage son, probably close to twice my age, 14 or so. His name was Rob. So naturally, when we'd visit their house, I would gravitate towards Rob's room. And Rob had a lot of things going for him. He had a real cool stereo, he had a TV in his room, and this is stuff that you just don't have back in the early 80s. And amongst all this, Rob had a stack of records. And there was always something playing in his room. And in that stack of records, Rob had a few that just truly caught my eye and blew my mind at the time. And among them was AC/DC's Dirty Deeds Done Dirt Cheap. And I can just remember being captivated by this guy's voice, this Bon Scott, I would later find out. His voice, there was just something sinister there. It wasn't a normal register and everyday voice that you would hear. And also in there was Highway to Hell. And I can just remember staring at the cover. Who is this guy with the tail and the horns, and what's happening there? What is that? And just being really pulled into it.
I grew up with heavy metal. I had two big brothers who were listening to heavy metal all the time. Bands like Mötley Crüe, Rat, Twisted Sister, Def Leppard, and other early 80s heavy metal bands like that. So I have to say that heavy metal has been a big part of my life since the very beginning.
Most of my friends were into the same kind of music I was in. I hung out with what we called the rockers at the time. You know, this is in the early 80s, and us rockers, we went to school wearing, you know, our jeans and our Twisted Sister shirts and our denim vests with the album covers painted in the back, and I'd mow lawns in my neighborhood to buy records. The earliest records I remember buying, Peter Frampton Comes Alive and Boston, which were popular in the, you know, in the 76, 77 time period. And from there I started getting into heavier stuff. And I'm pretty sure it was Aerosmith, Toys in the Attic, and Kiss, Rock and Roll Over. Ted Nugent, Double Live Gonzo was another one that I got into very early on. Thin Lizzy, Live and Dangerous. I had a friend that went to grade school with me who was really into Angel and got me into Angel. Alice Cooper, Black Sabbath, Jimi Hendrix. Those were some of the early records that I purchased, the early bands I was into.
The one in the stack that really caught me the most was Ozzy Osbourne's Speak of the Devil. And I can distinctly remember Rob playing that record, and I would just sit half scared and half captivated by the cover and the inner gatefold of that record. And I truly believe beyond all shadow of a doubt, staring at those records and listening to those records there in Rob's room as a 7 or 8 year old, the pavement was laid, the foundation was set, it was done.
I remember when Eliminator by ZZ Top came out. I heard that and I thought it was awesome. And I had it on tape. And I played that thing and I just loved these songs. And one point I was listening to it and going, God, the guy's been playing guitar for like 5 minutes. That's all he's been doing. It's just a 3-piece band and it just sounds so good. And it's funny because to this day I actually don't find the guitar to be the most interesting instrument, but that combination of the guitar, the bass, and the drums just completely does it for me.
1977, 1978, somewhere around in there. Had friends that had older brothers and sisters, and they were hearing, you know, Kiss and that kind of stuff, and mainly Kiss. That's what got us all excited. I remember them bringing in pictures and magazines, you know, of Kiss, and I remember drawing all the guys' faces, the makeup, before I even got to hear them. And it wasn't until a couple cousins, I think they had Double Platinum or Love Gun, right around that era, played some Kiss for me, and that was it, man. It was just all Kiss all the time, you know.
My very first own record was Killers, a compilation album by Kiss, My dad bought it to me in 1983 when I was 6 years old, and he also bought me my second record, Animalize, also from Kiss, in 1984. So those were my very first own records.
One of the earliest times I can remember as far as what was heavy metal to me was Van Halen, discovering Kiss at such a young age, Quiet Riot. I remember sitting on the couch watching MTV in the early days, you know, just waiting for the Van Halen video Jump to come on, and I'd get restless waiting for it to come on, and playing along on my drums at the time to those bands and everything. That to me was metal at the time. I thought that was the heaviest stuff I've ever heard.
But I lived in Germany for a few years in the 80s. And it's funny because you can see this on YouTube now. But when I first moved there, like late in 1983, there was a special on TV where they just broadcast this whole concert in Dortmund. And the bands in the that were playing, it was Ozzy Osbourne, it was Judas Priest, Iron Maiden, the Scorpions, I'm pretty sure Quiet Riot and the Michael Schenker Group. The Scorpions I thought were great. Judas Priest kind of blew my mind. I wasn't really ready for them yet, but they definitely made an impression on me. But Iron Maiden, the set that they did, and it was, you know, Peace of Mind had just come out. They had like the huge like Eddie behind the stage, and you know, sort of the snarling face, and the music just seemed so heavy. And that was really what opened it up. That was when I started thinking about heavy metal as something like, wow, there's this whole like thing out there that I've never heard of before. And it seemed so fascinating and so intimidating at the same time that I just had to start learning more into it. And it wasn't that much long after that I actually got my first copy of Peace of Mind.
I also remember when I was a kid, we were visiting my cousin who had just bought the Peace of Mind by Iron Maiden on vinyl. And when I saw the album cover, I was thinking, what the hell is this? I must hear this music immediately. I've been a huge Iron Maiden fan ever since.
And from there, you know, started checking out the other hard rock bands, heavy metal bands, whatever you want to call them at that era, you know, AC/DC and Deep Purple, and then around 1980, man, just everything exploded. You know, heard Judas Priest for the first time, Van Halen, and it just steamrolled from there.
I started getting into metal like in the late 80s when I saw some magazines in the bookshop. I saw some metal magazines, and before that I already saw some metal people walking on the streets, and I thought, hey, that looks cool. So when I saw the magazines, then I bought one of those magazines, and then later the day after, I asked some of those people, those metal people at school, if they could lend me some tapes, and they gave me some tapes, and then that's where I really discovered hard rock and metal, thanks to those people.
I think 1978, my mother was watching the American Music Awards because Elvis had died the year before, the summer before in '77, and I believe they were doing a tribute or something to Elvis on the American Music Awards that night. I remember sitting up watching it, and all of a sudden Dick Clark introduces Kiss. Kiss were playing live from like Madison Square Garden or something. Once I saw that, I was hooked. Just the theatrics of it all, the makeup. The song probably was just kind of on the, you know, in the background. I mean, just looking at the theatrics of it all and the bombs and explosions and all that shit. That's what caught my eye right away. I was hooked from then on.
In 1986, with the video clip The Final Countdown from the Swedish band Hero, I felt the same experience and emotions. It was my favorite song of that year, but only in 1988, when I watched an Iron Maiden video clip, something deep inside me said, man, you have to dig these old bands with long hair. And so it was. I started looking at Iron Maiden magazines, articles. The band has just released the album Seventh Son of the Seventh Son, and I bought a bootleg tape from Killer's album, in a street market in a little town where I lived in the northeast of Portugal.
I think the next day or the day after I went to Kmart, my local Kmart, with my grandmother and she bought me 2 Kiss albums, which I still have after almost 40 years. I still have those exact copies of those records.
The first time I remember hearing a sound that was different than my dad's Bob Seger or my brother's ZZ Top was Quiet Riot's Slick Black Cadillac. It was pouring out of my neighbor's window and somehow was drifting over into mine. And I was like, what is that sound? And I ran outside and listened to my neighbor actually play the record over and over again. It was Slick Black Cadillac, and pretty soon after that it was Come On Feel the Noise.
Earliest memory is from when I was about 10 or 11, sitting in the back seat of my car, of my parents' car, and Def Leppard was coming on with Animal, and after that there was Gorky Park, Moscow Calling, and that's the earliest memory, and I remember liking it.
It was January 28th, 1976. I was 5 years old. My brother took me to see my very first Kiss concert in Detroit, Cobo Hall, Michigan. I remember him telling me that they were clowns on stage, so I wouldn't get scared. And there was a demon up on stage spitting blood and shooting flames and out of his mouth, and for a 5-year-old that would be a pretty scary show. But I'll tell you what, I was hooked just like that. 2 short years later, on television, Kiss Meets the Phantom of the Park was aired as a TV movie. I remember going to school and writing the Kiss logo all over all of my books and getting excited for this movie to come up on TV the next night. That forever changed my life, changed my music for forever. As you can tell, I'm a huge Kiss fan. I even got Kiss tattooed on my arm. I'm a member of the Kiss Army for life.
Yeah, my taste in metal, hard rock, is from my big brother. He introduced me to a lot of bands, Extreme, Mr. Big at first, and later on Dream Theater, and that sort of thing, Yngwie Malmsteen.
You know, my dad definitely started the roots as far as those, original bands. A good friend of mine that I met in high school, because at the time, I knew, Black Sabbath and Deep Purple and, a little bit of Pantera, things like that, and I thought I knew all this heavy stuff. Well, I meet my buddy that became a good friend of mine, and we actually started our first band together, and he started introducing me to all kinds of stuff like Coal Chamber and Slipknot and deeper Ozzy tracks and Sepultura, all kinds of bands like that, and I'm just like wow, like I never heard of this stuff before, and it was just kind of like I was a sponge. Show me more, and I just was hooked ever since. The
first time I really heard the really heavy metal was Wasp's Fuck Like a Beast back in, I think it was 1982, 83, something like that. And to be honest with you, it scared me. I mean, these guys were satanic. This guy was had blood coming out of his mouth like Gene Simmons, but he wasn't wearing all the theatrics, so I took this guy seriously. We had Wasp, we had Ozzy Osbourne, we had Motley Crue, we had Iron Maiden, so this was just another form for me to rebel against my parents' country music.
This is one of the first albums I ever bought, the debut by Poison, this one by Bon Jovi, the debut by Britney Fox, and then maybe around 89 I bought Life After Death by Iron Maiden, and then I was really searching for more heavier bands, and I was really lucky when on the flea market I found this album by Allenger. This is a band from the UK, and this is actually a Spanish release. It has the 2 Allenger albums on this vinyl, and this is the way I discovered more the underground heavy metal scene.
Blizzard of Oz by Ozzy, because once I was introduced to his deeper stuff, like even Crazy Train, like I didn't even know Crazy Train back then, and once I heard that, I was just like, who is this guitar player? And this is great.
I heard this Iron Maiden Killers record on tape over and over again, and it was my first contact with the sound of the gods, the heavy metal music.
My friends, or usually my friend's older brother, they were always hip to the newest stuff that was going on. I never forget going over to Aaron Baker's house for the first time and walking into his older brother's room and seeing the Motley Crue posters and the Cinderella posters, and going down into their basement and seeing the fluorescent pink guitar and keyboard and drum set up with the cowbell, and flipping through those records and seeing records like Twisted Sister and Wasp and Quiet Riot and Def Leppard. So I have to credit probably my friend's older brothers for their influence and turning me on to new bands that I wasn't aware of.
I also really loved, of course, Ozzy Osbourne, and I still love Ozzy Osbourne till today. Saxon, of course, Running Wild, also one of the first bands I started listening to. Scorpions, Alice Cooper, Black Sabbath, the Spanish speed metal band Muro, Metallica, or Guns N' Roses, or again hard rock, but that's what I started listening to.
Another of my favorite bands was Halloween. Kay Hansen for me is a wonderful musician, and Halloween introduced me to the German heavy metal, especially the raw speed thrash metal. Bands like Creator, Sodom, Destruction, and one of my favorite bands ever, Tankard, they made and still make me happy. As other thrash metal acts I found across the Atlantic Ocean, like Megadeth, Metallica, Overkill, Testament, and Slayer.
My cousin John threw on this record one night, and both of us perked up after we heard the first track, and we were both like, "What the hell is this?" And he's like, "Just listen, it's really, really cool." Turns out it was AC/DC. And AC/DC is my favorite band. They have been since that night in my cousin's house. And the album was Let There Be Rock. First track, Go Down, it was the first tune I heard from them. I was hooked. There was something about them. They were cool like Kiss, but they were nastier.
I'll never forget in junior high, I always walked around talking about my favorite bands and how much I liked heavy metal. And Kenny Gardner came up to me one day and said, "You think you listen to heavy metal? Check this out." And he took a tape of Metallica's Master of Puppets and slid it over to me. And from that day on, it changed my whole listening taste. It got heavier and harder really fast. I remember taking that tape home, playing it for the first time. I couldn't even decipher the sound that was coming out of the radio. And I was really excited about it. Started calling up my friends on the phone and going, "Here, listen to this," and holding the phone up to the speaker.
Next day, we went to the local mall. Me and my cousin Donnie went to the local mall, and we each got a copy of Let There Be Rock. And it just happened that week, AC/DC had put out Power Age, which today is my favorite album of all time. You got two 9-year-olds walking out with the same records. It was awesome.
You know, we would sit around and listen to these records and just, spend all this time just digesting them and finding reasons to like them or not like them. I definitely have a memory of, sort of my first exposure to some of the heavier stuff. I was already into, Van Halen and AC/DC and stuff like that. I remember I was at a friend's house. We went up and looked at his older brother's record collection. And he had, black metal by Venom and, the first Bathory and, the first Celtic Frost and the first Slayer. And we were looking at these records, and I was like, oh, my God. This shit just seemed so scary at the time. It's funny now, because those are all favorite bands of mine. But, back then, man, that stuff just seems so underground and so obscure.
After all these years, I still want to meet new bands, and above all, to share and gain knowledge of this wonderful community that are heavy metal fans. This whole movement is more than music. It's a way of being in society. We are not better or worse. We are just different, and it is this difference are what makes us unique.
There was and still is a metal scene here in Springfield. A lot of really good bands have come and gone, which is unfortunate. A lot of great talent around here, but it's definitely still thriving. Club Panama, which is one of our kind of a home venue, they're keeping the metal scene alive around here, and that's really the only venue that's doing it here in Springfield, unfortunately.
Actually, there were almost no metal scene at all here in Finland back in the early 1980s. That's pretty hard to understand nowadays because there are so many great metal bands coming from Finland.
When I kind of first started getting into the local scene, there were bands around, Shovelhead, Grit, Knee Deep. Those were probably the bigger names back at the time, and I kind of almost looked up to those guys and kind of strived to almost rival them, in a friendly way, but to almost rival them when I got my band started back in those days. Predominantly, I'd say around 2000 was kind of the big spike of them.
Well, I grew up around the DC and Baltimore area, and there's a great metal scene around there. Kind of more around the Baltimore area. DC was more named for the hardcore punk and Discord bands and all that. But you had Baltimore and all the bands from around that area that called Baltimore home, basically. And the two big ones that I remember, and kind of went on, got signed and all that. The first one was Kicks, and they got signed early, so they were almost, like 82, 83, first album I think come out. And they were just an amazing band. Kind of, like I said, got started a little earlier, but by the time I was old enough to get into bars and seeing them, they were on the Midnight Dynamite era and that kind of thing. And they were just fantastic, man. I remember going to see them film a video for Midnight Dynamite. And they got signed to Atlantic. Atlantic signed a lot of the bands up and down the East Coast, back the metal hard rock bands.
There's a huge heavy metal scene where I grew up, because I grew up in New Jersey in the 80s during the heyday of heavy metal, hysteria, and there was a lot to do there. New Jersey's a small state. It was surrounded by Pennsylvania and New York, and we used to go see shows in all three states constantly. So not only was there a lot of shows being played, big shows at places like the Spectrum, and then also there was a ton of smaller places we go to, like the Lemoore Club in New York, and Tower Theater in Pennsylvania. Then there was the Old Bridge Militia, which was out of New Jersey, and that was kind of a little further away from where I lived in Trenton, but it was still a huge scene for all the thrashers and metalheads there. Some of the bigger local bands growing up in New Jersey were, Twisted Sister were a huge band. They were a local club band, very popular in New York. Unfortunately, when I was a kid, I never could get to see them because they were always playing in the clubs. But they eventually signed to Atlantic Records and became gigantic. By 84, they were massive and getting massive airplay on MTV and the radio. And then there was bands like TT Quick, Anthrax, who became huge with one of the big four, Overkill. There was just a ton of bands that came out of that tri-state area right there. And then of course one that didn't become big, but one of my favorites, Heathen's Rage. You guys were my high school buddies, especially guitar player Tony Lee, who's still a buddy of mine today. And there's Tony right there.
But the big band for me growing up was Rat Child America, which just a fantastic band. They kind of got screwed over. They actually got signed, and they got into a fight about their name with the Rat Child in England. And they actually had pressed up some of the album covers for the first album, Climbing the Walls, and without the America on it. So that's how close this album was to coming out before they got into the spat with Rat Child in the UK. But it held the album up for a couple of years, and I think it hurt them. They could have been a bigger band. They were signed to Atlantic, and they did what they did. They ended up putting out 2 albums and changed their name to Souls at Zero, and ended up signed on Energy Records and put out 2 or 3 more albums. And of course Shannon plays drums with Godsmack now, which is cool. He went on to make a good living. So, but that was the big scene around where I grew up. It was Kicks earlier on, and then Rat Child. I think Kicks still towards the end of the 80s, because they kind of took off with the hair metal thing. They kind of changed their sound just a little bit and fit in a little more, and they were still one of the best bands to ever see live. Steve Whiteman's just one of the greatest frontmen ever. They're just fun. you ever get a chance to see Kicks, go see him.
And then also upstate New York, when I went to college in the late 80s, there was lots of bands in that area. Immaculate Mary was one of them, which I guess they didn't really become that big. Uncle Sam was another one, who again didn't become that big, but they do have a cult following. And then Dirty Looks was one who moved from Pennsylvania to upstate Rochester, New York, and signed a big contract with Atlantic Records and gained some popularity.
I was born in 1971, so like I said, I grew up with Kiss and AC/DC and Grand Funk and Led Zeppelin, and the list goes on. I love 70s rock. You know, like Angel and Stars. Stars are one of my favorite bands too. A wickedly, wickedly underrated rock band from the 70s, the Stars.
We have a couple local venues that are pretty famous. One is a Newport Music Hall, used to be the Agora, and also Alrosa Villa. It's more notorious for the tragic crime when Dimebag was killed in 2004, but has a long history of supporting local acts and local bands, and I've seen many shows there and have a lot of good memories there. But in Columbus, Ohio specifically, there's a few bands that came out, and I had to call out the Gods. They were a little bit before my time, kind of a 70s hard rock sound, maybe even a little bit of a southern rock, but the Gods were huge here. They play all the time, like at Alrosa Villa and Newport. One of my favorite local bands in the 90s was Victim. They kind of mixed metal with funk and rap, which was kind of popular at the time in the mid to late 90s. And they're no longer together, but some of the band members are still playing in groups today. But they just had a really cool sound. We had a lot of fun cranking it up and a lot of fun going to their live shows. Cool group of guys.
I remember when my big brother bought the debut album of Tarot, The Spell of Iron, in 1986, and I just couldn't believe that they were Finnish metal band, but they were one of the very first big metal bands here in Finland, so they are considered sort of the great grandfathers of Finnish heavy metal nowadays.
Portugal is a small country. We have a population that runs the 10 million people. We never had a big heavy metal scene, and in the 80s just a few bands had the chance to record a long play. We have important bands, for example NZZN can be considered the first heavy metal band to record an album in Portugal, and this only in 1981. Other acts like Vasco da Gama, Iberia, Tarantula, V12 or V12, Checkmate, Ramp, Double Say Noise had incredible recordings and a fantastic crowd reaction, but my favorite Portuguese band of all time is Iron Sword, and the guys are still in action. Just for reference, among all the bands in the activity in every musical genre, the best known Portuguese band in the world is Moonspell, and they are a kind of a national pride.
The heavy metal scene here in Philly was pretty good growing up. Granted, there was a lot more of the hard rock acts around, like Cinderella and Britney Fox, who I'm dear friends with the guys in Britney Fox. I got turned on to a lot of independent artists at that time. Some you've probably never heard of that never made it out of Philly or never done anything since 1986 or 87. On the heavier end of things, we had bands like Dominance, Faith or Fear, who I absolutely loved. I thought they were great. I think they were on Combat or Relativity or something. They put an album out called Punishment Area. That was fantastic. As far as national acts go out of Philly, it was bands like Cinderella, Britney Fox, Heaven's Edge, Tangier. I think we went to shows every other day, whether it be like national acts or independent, like just Bodies of Ours in all the clubs. Empire Rock Room was a big one. That's where I grew up, really. I started sneaking in there when I was 14 years old. Galaxy in Jersey. And we had like the Pontiac later on in Philly, which I saw. Like the Yo-Yos, which was Danny, McCormick from the Wild Hearts, his side project in the early 2000s. The Toilet Boys out in New York that were really good. Backyard Babies played there. It was a really killer little venue down on South Street. TLA's on South Street, which, you know, I saw tons of bands at the TLA growing up. But yeah, Philly was slamming back in the day. Nowadays, not so much. It's a shame. What are you gonna do?
But do I consider myself some, you know, big snobby vinyl collector? No, not at all. I just I collect records. That's what I do. I collect heavy metal records mainly. You know,
I still have some 45s in my collection that I remember getting for my birthday one year. I was probably turning 6 that year, and I remember my parents went and bought me a bunch of different 45s, and they kind of hid them around the house, and I had to find them, and I still have some of those today, so those definitely mean a lot to me every time I look at them.
Very first own records, the Kiss records, I got from my dad when I was 6 or 7 years old. Those are very special items in my collection and very important.
I think the first one I bought might be Extreme Porn Graffiti. I really liked the singer's voice, and Nuno Betancourt on guitar is an amazing guitarist.
Album most people consider to be like a true metal album would be Judas Priest, and I picked up a copy of Sin After Sin at the record collector in Trenton, and I got it out of the dollar bin. The reason it was in the dollar bin was because this was the cover, but it had this record inside of it, this being Stained Class. So it was basically how I discovered Judas Priest back in would have been early 80s, probably 82 or so. And I heard the song Exciter, and I just became obsessed with heavy metal after that. From there, I started, looking into bands like Motorhead and Saxon, and the whole new wave of British heavy metal movement I got into, and also started discovering the local bands like Twisted Sister and TT Quick and all the other bands that were popular in the area at the time.
I borrowed a lot of my dad's records, and obviously my stories harken back to Kiss a lot because that's just kind of my biggest thing, but I can vividly, well not vividly, but kind of remember the day that he finally handed me the first album, and that was my introduction and listening to it. And then I got a hold of the Hotter Than Hell album, and I was probably about 4 years old, and parents heard me up in the bedroom singing Hotter Than Hell, and they didn't like that. They took the record away for a couple weeks, got it back, and then quietly sung it still so they couldn't hear me. And
it started off as being mostly hard rock, but also progressive metal and melodic death metal. But the most I have on vinyl is the late 80s, early 90s hard rock metal.
It was a little bit hard in the beginning, of course, but of course later when I started working with my parents on the markets on Sunday morning, on the flea market, is where I made some money. And with that money, I could go maybe once or twice a month to the record store to buy stuff. And also I did clean some gardens. I washed some cars with the neighbors, so that's the way I got the money to buy records.
When it's time to collect, I always prefer bands from some countries because they have a very characteristic 80s sound that I love, such as Germany, Brazil and Portugal.
The hunt is part of the fun, going out to the record shows and record stores and digging through records and finding them, so I kind of enjoy that.
Like I said, growing up around Baltimore, DC, I saw Wrathchild albums, Wrathchild America and Kicks albums and all that, but I run into people, talking to people online about collecting metal, and they wig out over a Wrathchild America album. I saw them all the time growing up, but that's because I was in that area.
Collecting, yes, I really I enjoy Kiss collecting. I have over 3,500 Kiss records in my collection. I have 70 copies of Kiss Alive from all over the world. I don't have a single double in my collection. I've got them from Japan, from China, from Thailand, from Russia, from Germany, from France, from England, from everywhere, all over the world.
I've got 10 different copies of Power Rangers. Like I said, it's my favorite AC/DC record. I got 10 different ones from all over the world.
You get to the point where you kind of complete the discographies of the bigger bands, and then the B-level bands, the ones right underneath. And then you start looking for the crazy, stuff that you just never saw as a kid, unless you were in the right place, the right area, or whatever.
I remember, when they used to have the listening booth there, and that's the first time I heard Slipknot, putting on the sample, the headphone, listening to the sample of it, and, just what's new, what looks cool, Roadrunner Records, everything that came out on that label at one time was going to be good, no matter what.
It's not a rarity. I mean, some of this shit that I have, it could be worth 2 cents to somebody else. To me, it's worth, it's priceless.
I'm happy with my collection. I have a lot of stuff that I consider grails that the other person would consider a dollar bin fine, maybe.
I think I've found a couple of my so-called vinyl holy grails. For example, The Brave New World by Iron Maiden and Amok by Sentenced. They are pretty pricey records and quite hard to find for a reasonable price, but luckily I've managed to get those ones in my collection. But there's still lots of holy grails to find.
I just like the music and I like the history of it. There's nothing cooler to find some weird old metal album, you flip it over and it's like, that's the guitar player that went on to play with so and so.
Luckily, I never give up on vinyl records as many people did. This gave me the opportunity to buy vinyl records that some people start to replace by compact discs. I remember, for example, to acquire the majority of Iron Maiden discography by €1 or €2 per record.
Anthrax is another band, and I think I've loved every record that they've put out. Overkill, oh my god, Overkill, they just keep getting better. And Anthrax, the last Anthrax record, the first one with Joey Belladonna in years, is probably one of my favorite metal albums of the last 10 years.
I love the German heavy metal scene. Bands like Creator, Sodom, Destruction, Running Wild, Asset, Scorpions are the big names of the German scene. But for example, bands like Tankard, this is the live record, Fat, Ugly and Live, amazing live record. Or another good example, Samayan, Vibrations of Doom. Nobody talks about this record, and for me is one of my favorites ever.
As far as collecting, it's like, man, I just bought records as a kid, all through the late 70s, through the 80s.
Yeah, there was a certain amount of going with the flow, like when all my friends were into Deep Purple, I was the first one who went out and actually bought a copy of Made in Japan, because that was the double record, that was a little bit more expensive, But I also even then took a certain thrill in going out and finding something really, that nobody had never heard of.
I think most people just, don't start out as a collector, start out listening to music, buying records and enjoying what you got. And if you keep doing it, it just evolves into a collection and you end up being a collector looking for certain things.
I first discovered Voivod, I found out about it because I was looking at a list, like in one of those old magazines, like a mail order list. And I was actually on the phone with a friend of mine, and we were these corded phones, right? And we were reading through the list of the titles and sort of laughing about the ones that just seemed more like ridiculous. And the one that just really took the cake more than anything else, like Omen or some of these other names that we thought were really funny, was there was one that was called Voivod Roar. And that was just too funny. I was like, oh my god, I can't believe that's a real fucking record. So I was at the record store a few weeks later or something. They actually had a copy of a record of theirs. It wasn't that one, it was Killing Technology. But I asked them to put it on so I could sample through it. And much to my surprise, I absolutely loved it.
I'm a completist when it comes to certain bands. Bands like the Wild Hearts from England, who I've loved since day one. I have everything they've ever released on vinyl, even the promotional 7 inches and the giveaway 7 inches and CD singles that have never been available. you know, AC/DC had different tracks on different records because they had released 2 albums in Australia and then mashed those 2 albums together and pulled the best and released 1 album here. So there was tracks left over that were never released in the United States.
Half of my collection I would never let go.
There's some guys into it and they don't care other than it's rare, it's worth money, whatever, blah, 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 and I couldn't give 2 shits about that.
My record collection is really cool because it's made up of different people, and what I mean is I've been given a record collection from my uncle, from 2 best friends of mine. My grandfather's left me some records, and some of those are from my parents and from my brother. Plus, you put in what I've curated into this collection, and it becomes pretty personal. So the collection really is special to me, and there's some certain items in there that I would probably not let go of no matter how much you offer me.
I will say my collection has taken on like this weird, almost like an archival thing. There's some stuff in here that's fucking mind-blowing. It's amazing music. And there's some stuff in here that's just okay, and there's some stuff in here that's not all that good. But I keep it if it's metal because it's part of that history of it all. And again, it's a large collection now. You know, I'm up over 10,000 albums. But and it almost takes on, after a while, it takes on like this archival feel.
Buying records, I think, is one of the few things that we should hear our heart instead our inner reason, because only our heart can tell us the best records to buy are the ones you really love and enjoy.
Why vinyl is simple. It's tangible. It's something that you can hold. But that's now. You know, going back to then, it was just the normal format. It was what was out there and what was available. So you either picked up the cassette, and I do have now and did have then a ton of cassettes. And for no reason other than they were portable. They could go with me in my Walkman. But there was still just something about, I'm gonna grab that one on vinyl. Watching it spin, you know, looking at it, holding it, working with it, and almost forming a relationship with it to the degree that you become so familiar with it that you can't wait to get home to it and put it down and grab a pencil and kind of sketch and draw the cover on one of your school books that's been covered and messing it up so horribly bad that you beg mom to recover it for you, you know, before Monday came. And even just watching it spin and hearing it, and does it sound better? I think so. Some people do, some people don't. Does it depend on your setup? Of course. And let's be honest, you know, my stereo at the time was hardly anything to write home about. It was a JCPenney special that was probably 49 bucks. It had a plastic turntable on it, but it didn't matter. It worked and it sounded great. And to this day, it's something I've not put down. I still love and collect vinyl like an absolute madman, and still for all the same reasons. That magic just has never worn off.
It's what I prefer, it's what I grew up with.
I love vinyls because I love, of course, the artwork. Another thing I love about the vinyls is that the lyric sheets are very big. There's always a lot of photos. You know, plus the sound, of course, is great. And it's great to put the vinyl on the turntable.
I just prefer the physical format, but it's not just nostalgia for me. With vinyl you can enjoy the music with all your senses. Of course you can hear it, but you can also touch it and feel it, smell it.
You walk into a record store and you smell the vinyl. It's just got that smell. There's just something about it. So vinyl has just always been kind of the obsession for me.
I really like to watch the record spinning when I'm listening to music, and at the same time I really like to read the lyrics and check out the liner notes.
You feel like a kid again. You can't wait to get home, rip it open, and look at it and looking for inserts, and you just don't get that with CDs and obviously digital music. And then putting it on for the first time, and I almost feel like it's hearing it for the first time again when you listen to it on vinyl. As many times as you may have listened to that album on CD or digital, you put it on vinyl and it's like almost like the first time again. You just kind of hear things that you don't hear on those formats.
You know, some people spend thousands and thousands of dollars to travel across the country to go to Disney World and spend a week there. And then they spend thousands of dollars, they leave Disney, they come home, and what do they have? Plastic ears. You know, that's what they have, and a memory. Whereas I have this tangible thing that is always there. Even if I can't listen to it every day, I still have it. It still has the memories attached to it, and it still has the music if I ever do.
I mean, there's nothing like listening to your favorite song, closing your eyes, getting lost, letting that needle go over the vinyl record, and then when you get that chill up the back of your neck, that's when I know I've found what I was looking for. And I'm always in search of that.
Nostalgia. It's has the vinyl in your hand. Look at the cover, look at the liner notes, and look at the pictures.
That's the nice thing about having records. Even if their band's no longer around, you still have the music. Even if an artist passes away, you still have the music.
For me, vinyl records are the best way to listen to music. You need to take care of your records. It's like a ritual. It involves time and dedication.
There's more in just listening to music.
You go to iTunes, you download a new album. How many times do you just skip through to that favorite song of yours? If you get back to that album experience, there's so much more to unlock there.
Yeah, I don't know. Vinyl as a whole it's just changed it's made my listening broader, you know, because as we all get deeper into this obsession, it's like we got to get a better receiver, we got to get a better, you know, cartridge for our turntable.
And I have a ton of CDs. I have nothing against them, especially the earlier CDs. I've actually bought some newer stuff on CD, and it was okay. And I actually picked up the vinyl, and it blew me away. It just sounded so much better. And again, I'm not sitting here saying, "Oh, it's all about vinyl. It sounds so much better." It's just, you know, it's what I prefer. In that one instance, the vinyl just really blew me away.
I just find I want to try and collect all the stuff I had on CDs and tapes. I want to get on vinyl now.
To a certain degree, it was availability, really. I mean, when I was living in Germany in the 80s, you'd see like maybe a shelf like this with tapes, and then like a whole shop full of records. For me, I mean, vinyl isn't really something I sort of came back to, or something that, you know, in the last few years I rediscovered as something from my childhood. It's really something I've carried around with me. Every time I've moved, I've had, you know, the most difficult part of the move has been getting the records schlepped around. But that said, I really do believe that a record collection is a reflection of someone's personality. I feel like it helps me understand them better as a person.
I give away tons of music. Tons of music. Especially in the last few years, I've given away, I can't even tell you how many records and CDs that I've given away. There's no reason to just hog it all for yourself, first of all. Second of all, I want to share what I love with other people. I think if you love something, you want to other people to enjoy it as well. You know, music is something I enjoy, and certain bands I like, so I want to share it with my friends. Hey, have you heard this? And I'll give them a record or a CD or whatnot. I do not do downloading, and I don't share music that way. So yeah, I give away tons of records to people, tons of CDs to people, all across the world, actually.
You know, a lot of us that you see in this documentary, we're all in this thing called the vinyl community. And a lot of that community is about giving and sharing. And I've received a lot of it. I've given some of it. I've, you know, met so many great people doing this. And it's, you know, we got this thing called VCLT, Vinyl Community Love Train. You know, I kind of remember, you know, it was like, hey, I think so-and-so would dig this record. I'm gonna send it to them. Hey, check this out, man. I think this is up your alley, even though it wasn't up mine. You know, if not, hey, pass it on to another person. And that's kind of how it's always been.
When I can find a record in my record store or part of my collection that somebody wants and just can't find, there's no bigger thrill for me than to send that off to the guy and then him open it up and say, wow, I can't believe you sent this to me. So, I mean, to me, that is just absolutely amazing.
Yeah, I love sharing music, especially with my wife and my sisters. I like to introduce them to new music, especially music that don't get played a lot in the radio, or maybe they know the hits of some artists, but they don't know really what the artist make, because the hit maybe be a acoustic ballad or more listener-friendly song, and maybe the back catalog is more heavy. Or
I've curated my collection over a long period of time, and some of the items that I have are very hard to find, or they're a really cool album or something I really used to like or like now. And it's hard to let go of some of that. But I really find that once I tore myself away from some of the stuff I thought I wanted so bad and gave it to somebody else, just their reaction and the way they appreciated it just made it worth it for me. So I find it a lot easier to give and share music a lot more than ever now.
The artwork is very important for me personally, almost as important as the music itself.
Judas Priest Painkiller, this like creature riding this motorcycle with these saw blade wheels.
Korn's self-titled, you know, it's kind of a mysterious, like what exactly is going on there? What's that guy holding, you know, in the shadow?
I mean, the Iron Maiden record covers blew my mind, right?
Somewhere in Time or Power Slave by Iron Maiden, there's so many details in the artwork.
Power Slave. I could just sit there and listen to the album and stare at the album cover and find all kinds of little nuances I might have missed before.
You know, something about Ride the Lightning from Metallica.
You have Master of Puppets with the crosses and the dog tags, the soldiers' dog tags on it.
The cover of Master of Puppets I always thought looked kind of sloppy and just kind of slapped together, and like on Ride the Lightning, the electric chair just seems so small in the middle of the thing. I just thought it looked like shoddy record art. You know, I mean, I got way into that band, obviously, just like everybody else did in the mid-'80s. But it took me a little bit longer because I thought the art was lousy.
I just loved looking at that Gene Simmons solo album cover because it always kind of freaked me out when I was young.
Megadeth Rust in Peace with Vic up there, and then you have the president sitting behind him, and they're covering up something apparently at Hangar 18.
Kiss Destroyer, Kiss Love Gun.
You have Vulgar Display of Power with a guy getting his face crammed in by a fist.
Sometimes it can be very cheesy though, almost like some B-class horror movie or something.
You know, there is something special about those homemade album covers that you just don't get that today. You know, knowing that someone actually sat down, took the time to draw up this picture, or you know, especially if it was a member of the band themselves and it's their own, you know, idea, and it's not just someone sitting at the record company that's coming up with this, you know, Photoshop piece of art.
Now, there were a lot of things at the time, you know, kind of scared me off a little bit. Like I'm thinking of like the Exciter records, like Exciter Violence and Force or Exodus Bonded by Blood. I mean, that's a pretty crappy looking cover, you know? I mean, it's awesome, it's a classic, and obviously everyone knows it's a classic record, but I mean, look how corny that painting is. I mean, that kid's eye looks all fucked up, and the demon looks totally ridiculous. And what's he tearing the chunk out of anyway? The record cover? It's like that Tubes record or something, you know? But the thing is, that's what I look for in record covers now, because like the more amateurish a record looks, the more I kind of get a kick out of it. I mean, something like this just makes my day. This isn't quite so amateurish. This is actually really well painted, but you know, thematically, it's a little bit of its time, shall we say, you know, but I see something like that and I go, oh man, I've got to hear that thing. Or, let's see if there's another one here. Oh, here we go. Here's another one, actually. This is a good example of one that I came back to from the cover. It was Exhumer. Remembered seeing this around, and didn't actually get a copy of the record until years later. But again, you know what I mean? It's kind of an obvious cover. The Friday the 13th movies were pretty big at the time, you know. But these sorts of things stayed with me anyway, and the fact that it was sort of capitalizing a little bit on some of the sort of horror motifs of the era really just makes it even better.
A very important part of heavy metal is the image. Record covers have sometimes a huge contribution when you decide to buy a new record. Some are truly masterpieces with a wonderful package. This association between music and artwork are already done since the 70s, but the 80s was the real highlight of a good record cover, and an appealing artwork is an excellent way to convince people to buy records.
Yeah, growing up in Philly, I mean, the weekends were always about hanging out with the friends, listening to tunes, or going to a show, or, you know, like a typical Saturday night was hanging out at somebody's house, one of our buddies' house. Preferably their parents were out of town. Drink some beers and listen to whatever's new. We kind of did listening parties back then where, like 4 or 5 of us would hop into the car, go to the mall or go to the local record store and buy an album we never heard, never read about at the time, because we didn't have internet back then.
I spent tons of hours recording radio songs, or ask other headbangers if they want to make some tape ready. Sometimes because I had to save money on school bills and use the savings to buy cassettes.
I'll never forget hiding the radio behind my bed with a set of headphones ready for Saturday night at 11 o'clock when the 1-hour heavy metal show would come on. And I just couldn't wait to check out the new bands.
Oh, it was spent at home, alone in your room. Growing up in the middle of nowhere America, there was just nothing to do but spend that time in your room and play through tapes and CDs and make your own mixtapes. Listen to FM radio broadcasts on the little crappy stereo in your room, and things like the King Biscuit Flower Hour, maybe there was a show on that. Getting into the early 90s, things like Headbangers Ball rolled around. And I can remember sitting in front of, the big old 19-inch console TV with a pretty primitive VCR on top of it with a VHS tape in there and your finger on the pause button. So you can kind of make your own greatest hits videotape. In Headbangers Ball, at the time, the bulk of the 3 hours was dominated by things like Mr. Big and Slaughter and Trickster. And although I've learned to forgive a lot of that now, at the time you'd cringe and you'd just sit there glued waiting for the triple thrash threat. The 12 minutes of the show where they were going to play something cool, like Metal Church or Metallica, Megadeth or Slayer or Morbid Angel or Pantera or something like that. But the typical teenage Saturday night here was just that. It was spent at home. There wasn't access to a whole lot of concerts or anything like that going on. I certainly didn't have a car or means or money or any way to get there anyways, so it was a pretty solitary thing. But looking back on it, man, I wouldn't change it.
When I was still living here in Springfield, there were 2 different public access shows that were dedicated to nothing but metal. And that was another thing that kind of introduced me to a lot of bands that I was unaware of. But one was called The Show, and hosted by 2 younger guys. I think they were brothers. They showed all kinds of awesome underground videos. Actually did a backstage interview with Dimebag Darrell and Vinnie Paul at the last Pantera show at Hare Arena. It was just really cool to me, seeing these public access guys doing something that big. So basically I'd sit there on weekends and have the VCR ready, just sitting there recording different music videos.
I was spending the night at friend's house. If they had cable TV, I was downstairs late at night, huddled up next to the TV with the volume really low, trying to catch all that I could catch on Headbangers Ball. That's where I saw all my favorite videos, and then also got turned on to new bands.
Yeah, I was the leather jacket with the jean jacket vest over top, with the patches on it and the hair down to the ass, and tight jeans with, Nike high tops. That was me. That was all of us.
And then, of course, a little bit later down the road, started playing in bands. So, my Saturday nights, a lot of the time consisted of playing gigs.
I had to be a closet headbanger. I really had to kind of sneak my music. Heavy music and definitely hair bands and metal bands were not permitted in my house. I had to smuggle it in and hide it in my room under periodic inspections. If some of this music was uncovered, it would find its way into the trash.
I definitely faced a lot of resistance, and I'm not going to say I still don't. Definitely on the parent front, my dad was in this, somewhat heavy stuff to an extent, but I remember he always said he wouldn't even listen to Black Sabbath because he always thought it was really like satanic or, the typical parent answer. And
thankfully my parents never really stood in my way getting into heavy metal or liking it or wearing the concert tees or growing my hair or even piercing my ears or wearing earrings. They never really got in the way of all of that. They were very, very accepting. And looking back now, I'm genuinely shocked and amazed at just how accepting they were. what wasn't so accepting at the time, because heavy metal was still relatively new, at least in terms of, you know, the updated horrific imagery. Heavy metal may have existed in the 70s, what we call hard rock now, but in the 80s was where all that real horrific imagery started to come out, like Eddie from Iron Maiden, or those covers, those first covers from King Diamond or Merciful Fate. And of course it all translated down to clothing, like t-shirts and hats. And where I remember running into just a ton of opposition was at school. You know, the Metallica shirt, right, with the toilet and the knife coming up out of it. I distinctly remember that shirt landing me in detention on more than one occasion, and definitely getting threats of, you know, you'll be suspended from school for a day or 3 days if you wear that shirt again, or hey LJ, you need to turn that shirt inside out for the rest of the day at school because it's offensive. And so that's where the real opposition came from.
You know, a lot, even today, you know, I still get people like, oh, you're in a band? Yeah. Oh, what kind of music you play? And then, you know, heavy stuff. And then you just kind of get that, oh, like, you know, a lot of people will get that stereotype opinion about metal. And, you know, it's just, to me, it's just people being closed-minded. You know, people need to be more open-minded. Don't be such idiots about your taste in music. You know, take a chance. Don't just damn it when you don't even give it a chance.
If there was really any true opposition at all in collecting or listening to music and growing up in the 80s, it was positive cash flow, because the positive cash flow was negative. There was just never enough money. There was just no funds. And you do almost anything to get money. From stealing quarters, a quarter at a time from your brother's bank to hope he doesn't notice and pound you, or using money from your paper route, or begging for an allowance, or saving lunch money. You do anything to line your pockets with some money. Now, looking back on it though, it definitely wasn't all doom and gloom. It was because of that, because of those limited funds and my own impatience at the time, that I would look at the bargain cassette rack, you know, at stores. And by that I mean cassettes they had, or albums they had, for $4.98 instead of $8.98. And it was because of that I very first picked up albums, early albums by AC/DC from the mid-70s, or mid-70s albums by Kiss. You know, it was the mid-80s at the time, so those albums had a decade on them, and you could pick them up cheaper. And if I just didn't have the patience to wait to drop $8.98 on the new King Diamond album or the new Megadeth album, I would go back and grab two of those for the price of that one. So it's actually thanks to that I ended up owning and immersing myself in a lot of those albums from the 70s.
I was born and lived in a very small town with big traditions and moral customs. And if you have long hair and listen heavy metal music, in their minds are something of devil worshippers, drug addicts and homeless. So it was difficult times for me to live in a small town. For example, the day of my father's funeral, the priest wanted me out of the church for having long hair, until someone told him, "Priest, this young boy is the son of the deceased."
My wife and I were going to a church that thought that all heavy metal was evil, and matter of fact, the pastor of the church preached a message saying that all metal was just incantations, that's all it was. And he went on to start talking about some bands that I knew and was friends with, and was saying things that just straight up weren't true. That was kind of bizarre for me, and when I approached the pastor about it after the service, it didn't go well.
People say this a lot, but it's really true. Music is one of the best medicines there is. You know, Kiss, I'm such a huge Kiss fan. You know, their music just helps me through hard times. Like if I'm in a real down and out mood, I could just sit down and listen to Kiss, and I just start feeling better, and you know, it peps me up. Just it does something to me. And you know, back when my dad passed away, you know, and he's the one that showed me Kiss. We shared that love, and I remember listening to Kiss, and it really helped me, you know, get through that whole time after he passed.
The heavy metal music has become part of my life, something that helps me to live happier.
Some kind of metal when I'm in a special mood. if I'm down or if I need to get off with some aggression, or I listen to some sorts of metal.
The heavy metal music has helped me through some harder times in my life. If I'm feeling depressed, I just can't stand any happy music. That only makes me feel worse. But when I listen to some heavy metal, for example, Sentenced singing about putting their head in the noose, that makes me feel better immediately. That makes me understand that my things are not so bad after all. And that's pretty weird, because if you're feeling depressed, the depressing music helps you to feel a little better. So, but that works for me perfectly.
There are dark days in anybody's life, and instead of getting into other things, I was able to get my frustrations out by listening to just the heaviest thing I could find. So on my deepest, darkest days, probably have the radio shut off. But if it's a really bad day, just a little bit of metal can help me, power through what I need to get done.
But I was going through a really hard time, and I was really depressed about something. I was at a friend's house, and I couldn't even enjoy hanging out with my friend because I was just so deep in my own head. And he had a copy of The Last in Line by Dio, and we pulled that out and put it on and played it, and we listened to it from start to finish. And by the end of the record, I was feeling yeah, everything is great, And if you listen to Dio, thematically, that's all what he's all about you can stand up, and blah, blah. And in a way, when you're a grown-up and you listen to it, it kind of sounds so high school. And that's why it's funny that I was in my mid-30s when this happened, but I almost wanted to write him a letter and say, "Dear Mr. Ronnie James Dio, thank you for making The Last in Line, because even though I'm about 20 years older than the kid you're probably targeting when you wrote that thing 30 years prior, man, it did exactly what you wanted it to do for me today."
I can remember when we had a family member who was dying and we were taking care of it. There was something about driving in my car from work to home. There was just certain music that really just it just needed it. It helped me. It gave me a little bit of stability. And I remember when my wife's mother was really sick. And this is not metal, but there was a Journey record that I just kept playing over and over and over again. And then for some reason during that time period, that Journey record just spoke to me and just gave me a little bit of hope, gave me a little bit of joy, and that's kind of what music is for, right?
Slayer is a band that I always followed. I have all these records, some even in multiple versions and formats, but in 1998, when the albums in music came out, I felt the Slayer that I love will never be the same band. I think with the albums in music record, and this is only my personal opinion, the band began to play the music, what the music market want to hear, and not what the die-hard fans want to listen. They try to adapt, but never manage to reach the level of creativity in records like Show No Mercy, Raining Blood, Seasons in the Abyss, and probably never will. I would love to be wrong, but in some way I keep supporting the band and compared Slayer with other bands. Come on, they're still rocking.
I think bands have a tendency to run their course, sort of in due time. Bands after a while, they either break up or they start making crappy records. In a way, if there's a band that I like that breaks up, it kind of makes me happy, because they won't stick around long enough to start making crappy records. Given how bands will sort of hang on for record after record after record, like Metallica is really a great example of this. They made 3 classic records, in my opinion. I know some people argue about the 4th or the 5th one, but I think they made 3 great records. And by 1988, 1986, they were really done. They said what they were going to say, and I kind of feel like the whole thing would have been more perfect. The legacy would have been left intact if they had just stopped at that point in time, And especially since they were fortunate enough they made plenty of money, they really didn't need to sort of keep going and that sort of thing. It's like they had to tour for the next 20 years to get by. I think they should have just left well enough alone.
Through the early 90s, when supposedly grunge killed it, but actually metal just kind of killed itself. It was just, it got so big and overblown. You know, it's just a lot of bands are starting to sound the same, and you know, and that happens a lot. You know.
No, I'll never forget when I was in high school and I was taking my friend Sean home from school, and I thought it'd be cool to pop in some Dr. Feelgood from Motley Crue. And he said, "What is this? This is hair bands. This is glam metal. What is this stuff you're listening to?" And although I didn't, make my whole world around Sean's opinion, I did kind of realize I was hanging on to metal for a little bit too long. And this was almost the mid '90s, and it was time to let go of some of that. So I kind of used that as a catalyst to get into some different music. And before too long, I kind of went and listened to Pearl Jam, and got into grunge a little bit, and aside from like Rage Against the Machine and Pantera, but really I just kind of pulled back a little bit and started to get back into the classic rock and rock roots, which eventually brought me back around to metal again. Finally, bands like Machine Head started to come out of the mid '90s with this this new wave of American hardcore, which really kind of turned a light bulb on for me again, and kind of refreshed music and brought a whole new dose of metal. So now it was okay to listen to metal again. And believe me, I jumped in with both feet.
In my youth, I always kept hearing heavy metal and thrash metal, but between '89 and 1995, I was pretty much into death metal. I was a young earth kid and loved that death metal wave because I follow almost the birth and its explosion.
I remember hearing older people say at the time, if you weren't alive in the 60s, you that lived through the 60s, you don't understand it, you don't get it. And it's almost the same way with the 80s for metal. It was just, it was the golden age of metal, and younger people today, it's so cool that some of them are into it, they're checking it out. But if you weren't the right age in the 80s, if you weren't alive in the 80s, it's just hard to understand how big it was. It was just so massive. The magazines and even on radio and MTV, it was just crazy. But it was a great time,
To me, metals is Metallica, Slayer, Anthrax, Megadeth, Overkill, Testament, Exodus. So once those guys are gone, I think metal's that era of metal is gone.
It has been a crazy journey, starting with Poison and ending with, not ending, but right now I am playing stuff like Kettle Decapitation, brutal death grind metal. But of course in between I'm listening to all type of metal and hard rock. I love death metal, I love black metal. I love, of course, the newer bands like Enforcer or Pleasant that play new wave of traditional heavy metal, and that's where I am. It has been a journey, and I'm still on that journey, discovering new records and new bands every day.
There's so much music out there, and there's so little money in my bank account to buy it all.
But I'll tell you what, the older these guys get, the better they get. I honestly believe that. Anthrax being one of them, Overkill being one of them. I heard a new Megadeth track recently, and it was like a throwback to Peace Cells. The new Slayer record, the latest Slayer record, I thought was really good.
I do try and keep up with the new stuff, and I'm loving this new wave of traditional heavy metal. It's just like the best thing that's come along for a long time. Bands like Amulet, Ambush, Hittin'. Oh man, it just goes on. Black Trip, Stallion, Midnight Priest. There's a ton of them.
You look at the generational gap between parents or moms and dads and their kids, especially back in the 50s and 60s, where the music that they listened to was rock and roll, and it was just so, it was the devil's music, and you can't listen to that, or I'm going to disown you, or if you grow your hair long, get out of my house. And then if you look at nowadays, where now the kids are turning the parents on to heavier and harder music, and the parents are enjoying it. So I noticed that generation gap getting a lot smaller.
Metal is incredible to collect. It's so vast and big, especially that 80s era, you know, and it just go on forever.
When someone outside the heavy metal world asks me which is the best record to start hearing this musical style, I always say Judas Priest, Painkiller. Why? Because this album has everything that defines the heavy metal music. Every single note from all the instruments are just perfect.
I'm still on the lookout for many of my grails on vinyl, maybe because they're really expensive or really hard to get, but
yeah, I don't think there will ever be a point where I'm done collecting. It's just impossible. I mean, to this day, thanks to things, just all things internet that you can read about, learn about, or hear about, or be inspired to check out either a newer band or an album or a band that you just completely missed back in the day. Somehow it just wasn't in your field of vision and you never heard of it. There's just no way I ever foresee myself at a point where, you know, I'm done. I have every album, I have every cassette that I'm ever going to need, because something is just always going to pop up and I'm going to want to check it out. It doesn't mean it's something that can be had right away. It may actually take some time to find a usable or a good condition copy that you can pick up, but man, I don't see myself ever being done, ever.
There's other stuff in you know, I can see here that I will never listen to again, that I'll probably end up getting rid of. I always say that, though I never do.
I've come a long way. I've started at hard rock. I moved along to progressive metal and so on, but there's still a lot to discover, and I think you're never finished listening to new music.
When I take the 6 feet dive, I really hope that my kids will get my record collection. Of course, I'm not going to be around, but I really wish that they won't throw them away or won't sell them. I really hope that they will understand how important my record collection was for me, and it was such a big part of my personality too. It would be very nice idea if they would keep my record collection and they would continue listening to music and maybe even continue my record collection.
We're in a digital age right now, and it's really hard to predict where we're going to go. I know I'll always keep my record collection, and I'll be able to pass that down to my kids. So I hope the younger generations and the generations that are coming up can appreciate at least the CD, if not vinyl records, because if everything goes digital, everything's wireless, you lose a big part of what the music's about.
If you ask me, do you want to change anything of your teenage years listening heavy metal? Not even a second, because this music gave me joy, strength, and formed as a man, and today I'm a survivor. Thanks to my passion for heavy metal and its lifestyle, I became a successful person, and I love this wonderful world of loud music.
I think the future is bright. I think young people are listening to metal as much as they did before. Not the same kind of metal, but it's here to stay.
The future of heavy metal is not going to be easy, because now we have the big festivals, we have the big bands still filling up stadiums and festival fields, like Iron Maiden, Judas Priest, Black Sabbath. But what's happening with the smaller bands? The smaller bands like Enforcer, you know, they are like playing in little places where only 50 or 100 people are going to see them. And of course, in the future, when the big bands are gone, what is going to happen? What is going to happen is that metal is going back into the underground. Because I don't see Enforcer headlining Wagen or Bang Your Head. I don't see it. But I hope so for them. But I don't care if this band stays small forever, because that's where we are. We are in the underground mentally, because the real metal people are there. And that's where I think the future of heavy metal will go again. It will go back where it started, in the underground.
Who knows? It's always going to be there, just in some form or another. I think it'll always be underground.
Honestly, I think the future of heavy metal has never been brighter. It's never been stronger. We're at a point today where almost all of our heroes from the 80s and even that continued into the early 90s are still going strong. The whole grunge explosion thing happened in the 90s, and you know, that's a topic for a whole nother day. You know, and things quieted down, but things have resurfaced, you know, not only with all of those heroes still going strong. I mean, your Megadeths, your Slayers, your Stripers, your Motorheads, your Judas Priest, your metal churches, these bands are all still going strong. But now joining them are all these amazing bands that fit into this new wave of traditional heavy metal. And this is bands like Cauldron and Skullfist and Action and Enforcer and on and on and on and on and on. And all of these new bands, they're amazing. You know, they're picking up the baton or carrying the torch proudly alongside their own 80s heroes as well. And the music is amazing. They wear their influences on their sleeve, but it's almost like a rebirth. But the rebirth with the teachers still there, so it's teachers and students if you want to look at it that way. But man, it's amazing. I've never felt stronger or more confident that heavy metal is alive, well, and well poised to continue, you know, for another 25 years. No question, it's just never been stronger or more exciting.
Next nothing, this coming, yet banging, metal. Next nothing, this coming, yet banging, metal. Next nothing, this coming, yet banging, metal.